the state of the art.
For infectious materials.
Viva el socialismo!
Any nuclear missile?
Kennedy tried to have you assassinated.
Kennedy.
If Saddam Hussein decided to leave, would you take him in?
Are you trying to trick me?
Viva la revolución!
MSNBC reports Castro's Cuba at the Crossroads. Here now, Andrea Mitchell.
One name towers above all others on this island nation of Cuba. Tonight, Fidel Castro, as you've never seen him before. We take you inside his biological laboratories and show you what he is doing with a former top-secret Russian spy station. And in a series of exclusive interviews, he talks about the war on terror, Saddam Hussein, the U.S. embargo, and much more.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestre Mountains,
Castro has been in charge ever since he led a guerrilla war, ousting another Cuban strongman in 1959.
now Batista has fled. A new leader is on the scene, Fidel Castro, in many ways an unknown quantity in his politics and policies.
At 76, he's the world's longest-serving government leader. 44 years as Cuba's absolute authority. Chief of the armed forces. Head of the Communist Party. And president of his country. He's known to Cubans simply as Fidel, or El Comandante. He's weathered all sorts of adversity and is still defiant as ever.
Everyone thought that Cuba would collapse, and we didn't. Years have passed. We will not collapse.
You have made changes in your economic system. Are you changing your views about socialism?
We have done some things that we didn't like, because no country was facing the situation Cuba faced. The revolution today has much more support than ever before.
During our visit with Castro, his energy appears boundless. Sunset seems to shift him into high gear. One of our interviews goes beyond 2 in the morning. First, he wants us to see a school for visually impaired and disabled children.
So these are your troops.
Our troops, as Castro calls them. You know Roberto? Our 2 camera crews. Carlito. We fit Castro with a wireless microphone. Is that comfortable? And his own staff adds one of their own. They record everything he says.
His right or his left? What do you prefer to go?
Traveling with us, Juanita Vera, for 20 years, Castro's personal translator.
Buenas tardes, ¿cómo están ustedes?
Representatives of the student collective and their principal greet us.
Muy buenos días, queridos visitantes. Le damos la bienvenida a la escuela social. Welcome to our special school.
¿Y esta chiquitica de dónde?
Such a little one.
Tell her good things come in small packages.
Dice ella que te diga que las cosas buenas vienen en paquetes chiquiticos.
Sí. Casi tenemos 64 docentes.
Here we have 64 teachers and 184 students.
That's a wonderful ratio.
A ratio of 1 to 3. This will be a typical classroom, a first grade classroom.
Buenas tardes.
In this case, these are not blind, they are short-sighted.
Castro proudly shows off his version of the concept, no child left behind.
Last year, he began to work with the computers.
Each of these students, he says, will get all the preparation needed for college.
The most important property that Cubans have is education and culture.
Down the hallway, a group of profoundly handicapped children, their lifelong limitations painfully evident. Many of the teachers work one-on-one.
This is your work? The whole day? How many hours?
From 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon.
Cuba's president thanks the children and introduces a topic dear to every child.
Have the lunches improved here? What do you like better, soda pop or milk? But milk is more nutritious. They haven't taught you anything in this school.
These students decided to put on a show for Castro. But even here, among the handicapped, it's clear political indoctrination starts with the first day of school.
Who is that man with so much power and glory?
This ode to Fidel, written by a first-grade teacher, now performed for Castro himself.
Who is that leader who behaves so well? He is without a doubt my leader, Fidel.
Later that day, another school. One of 15 high schools devoted to music, art, and dance. This is one of Castro's major commitments. He sees the arts and culture as the backbone of the revolution. And Castro's visit creates another one of those moments of understanding for outsiders. The political mold is at work, trying to form young Cubans into true believers. Castro seems genuinely moved by these students. A special moment for a man who still considers himself, first and foremost, a revolutionary. The moment of a lifetime for an admiring student. The indoctrination of the young gives Castro confidence the communist system he's created for Cuba will live on.
If I died tomorrow morning, there will be no problem here. The new generation is better prepared than the old one.
Castro is one of the most controversial political figures in modern times, but he says it is artists who are long remembered, not politicians.
As for history, Andrea, it's all very relative. When practically every politician has been forgotten, there will still be talk of the artists. For instance, Michelangelo, or the great writers, like Cervantes. Even Julius Caesar is rather known for the book he wrote about the Gauls than the battles he fought and won in the time of Rome.
After 44 years, Castro can afford to be philosophical. After all, he's managed to outlast all of his political enemies. They're either in jail, in exile, or dead. The following morning, Castro again takes us to what he considers his single most important battleground, winning over the hearts and minds of the young to the communist socialist ideal. To these Cuban college students, Fidel has the appeal of a rock star and the popularity of an underdog who has thumbed his nose at 10 American presidents. These students have been recruited to attend a secret new computer university without even being told what the curriculum is. They say all they needed to hear was Fidel wants them here.
They asked us to have a lot of faith.
We trust our commander. He's never wrong.
The secrecy here, a legacy of the Cold War. Until the summer of 2002, this was a top-secret KGB satellite spy station targeting America. When the Russians left, they stopped paying Castro $200 million a year in rent. An abrupt end to Cuba's dependence on Russia.
Does this symbolize the biggest change in Cuba?
It's a symbol of great change in Russia and great progress in Cuba.
Progress here means transforming rusting remnants of the Cold War into a new economic opportunity for Cuba. When these students complete their studies, Castro hopes they will be part of a new software industry. When we come back, does democracy have a future in Castro's Cuba? We'll meet some of the brave few inside Cuba calling for political reform and more human rights.
Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera.
Fidel Castro, the ultimate authority in Cuba. This is the appearance. Castro and his communist system seemingly as popular as ever.
¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva el socialismo!
But what is the reality? Ask Osvaldo Payá, and you'll get a different answer.
In Cuba, basic rights and basic freedoms are not respected.
Paya, a biomedical engineer, believes in working within the system for free elections instead of one-party communist rule. In Cuba, no one runs against Fidel Castro, ever. And no one gets on the ballot for lower office without party approval.
The hope for change in Cuba does not rest with Fidel Castro or the government. It's in the people.
So for 6 years, Paya's group collects signatures on a petition to force a referendum on democracy. Blacklisted, they're never mentioned in the government press, but still get more than the required 10,000 signatures.
It's a new moment for Cubans, which opens new hope for all.
Just in time for a visit by an internationally recognized champion of human rights, Jimmy Carter. With Castro's permission, Carter for the first time tells all of Cuba about the petition drive in a speech broadcast nationwide. Carter also meets with leading dissidents, several just released from prison.
What assurances do you have that some of these people will not end up back in jail?
They have decided that their meetings with me will not be adverse, at least to their overall ambitions. Maybe to their own personal safety. They've never put that first.
Carter's call for free elections here is unprecedented. But in Fidel Castro's Cuba, it's all but ignored. Life goes on. The next day, taxi driver Alberto Barrago and his friend Fernando continue to work on Alberto's '56 Chevy. The car is 17 years older than he is and requires 2 hours of work a day just to get started. So did they like Carter's speech?
Muy bien.
He liked the message, he says, but you have your elections, we have ours. For weeks afterward, the dissidents hear nothing about their petition for democracy. Then Fidel Castro responds with his own petition drive to make the current socialist one-party rule irreversible. Following his lead, 8.2 million Cubans, or 99% of the population, immediately sign up. Within days, the National Assembly approves the change unanimously. Still, when challenged about free elections, Castro has his own definitions.
I think that our country has proven over a course of 4 decades that it has a very high concept of human rights.
He has never included political freedom on his list of essential human rights.
If there was a real concept about human rights, 11 million children would not starve in the world every year, and so many others would not die for lack of medications and health care.
Fidel Castro told me that human rights are the right to an education, free health care, to culture, not political freedom.
These may be the rights of animals or robots, but we are human beings.
The government that for decades outlawed rock and roll now tolerates some cultural rebellion. This rap group complains about the Big Brother atmosphere, the government encouraging everyone to spy on each other. And there are other dissidents who want more than a guaranteed minimum of education, health care, and food. Vladimir Roca spent 5 years in a Cuban jail. What did you do to get sent to jail for 5 years?
They sent me to jail because I told the press that the Cuban people have the right to vote or not to vote.
The Cuban people have the right not to vote for the Castro
government.
There are other voices.
I defend life and liberty wherever I am.
Oscar Bisset, seen here in 1999, now in jail, charged with inspiring public disorder. Only occasionally do tiny groups of protesters risk prison to speak out, and usually indoors. Here's what happens when they try to stage a public rally using a bullhorn. Neighbors immediately mobilize to chase them away. They run off, defeated. When Castro invites the Pope to Cuba in 1998, dissidents hope he can bring more freedom as he did in Poland. But Cuba's Cardinal Jaime Ortega now says that was false hope. Castro's church is the Communist Party, made clear in every interview I've done with him over the years. The White House says that in order to have better relations with Cuba, they want to see multi-party elections, more expression of opinion.
¿Dónde está la libertad de expresión?
Who has freedom of expression when a candidate needs to invest over $1.5 billion in publicity? In Cuba, nobody spends a nickel.
No political ads in Cuba because there's only one party.
There is one party, but the party's like a church in a way.
In fact, many here worship Castro. Look at what happens when he faints on a blistering hot day 2 years ago. His loyalists are stricken at the very thought of Cuba without their comandante. That is the challenge for Cuba's small democracy movement. When we come back, a look back in time. Fidel Castro visits the United States and promises a democratic Cuba.
There's a place that I travel when I want to roam, and nobody knows it but me.
And tells Andrea Mitchell exactly what he thinks of U.S. officials who say he might be making biological weapons.
Fidel Castro denouncing his adversaries. His rhetoric has not diminished with the years. His speech-making skills go back to his days at the University of Havana, where he earned his doctorate of law. In 1959, Americans had one brief opportunity to hear Castro in English when he came to the U.S. just 3 months after seizing power.
Now meet the press. Our guest, Dr. Fidel Castro.
It was at the height of the Cold War, not a comfortable setting for a Cuban revolutionary leader.
I want to know where your heart lies in the struggle between communism and democracy.
I am not communism. I am not agree with communism.
To this day, he insists his words were not a lie, that he only converted to communism a short time later.
Senator Smathers of Florida says that you have many communists in your government. Is that so?
And because Senator Smathers said it ought to be true, I don't think that.
Some things don't change. Just as he does today, Castro attacks the Cuban exiles who fled to Florida when he took over.
In Florida, unfortunately, there are dozens of war criminals.
When do you intend to have an election in Cuba?
Oh, what we want is to get as soon as possible the condition for free election.
First you said you would hold elections in 1 year. Then you said 18 months. Then you said 2 years. Now you say 4 years.
I cannot tell exactly number of months because I am not supposed to know which difficulties we are going to have.
Don't you think the Cuban people will be ready for democracy for 4 years?
Yes, but you cannot impose to the people the free election if the people doesn't want.
Of course, an American-style democratic election never happened. Not in 4 years, nor in the 44 years since. When we come back, Castro in his own words today. On terrorism, his biological labs, Saddam Hussein, George Bush, and the U.S. trade embargo.
For Fidel Castro on Cuba and the U.S. embargo, if you are a businessman or a tourist, could this long forbidden island be in your future? Castro's Cuba at the Crossroads. We'll be right back.
Instead of his familiar army fatigues, Castro chooses a business suit for our formal interview.
I can barely recognize this place.
He allows us to convert his personal office into a temporary television studio.
What's going to be left of my office after this interview?
Castro says American visitors often arrive with at least one misperception. I see you have some signed baseball.
You know what? Every American who comes here brings you a baseball. Believes I'm a baseball player. I don't know. They have that idea.
Well, I saw you play baseball when President Carter was here.
Yo lo vi jugando béisbol cuando vino Presidente Carter. Yes, I have played many other sports.
Pero bueno.
Well, anyway.
No va el tiempo.
We better begin when you say.
The Cuban president is known as a night owl. It's already 11 p.m. when we settle in for our interview. Mic'd for sound and wearing an earpiece to hear the questions through simultaneous translation.
You were being very patient.
Castro, in fact, learned English in school, but no longer speaks it.
I saw a tape of you once speaking English on Meet the Press.
That was a long time ago.
More than any other head of state, Castro has a reputation for long-winded speeches.
I will do everything possible to be concise.
Please.
His aides tell us we must finish by 1 a.m., just 2 hours.
First, I wanted to start with some issues of great urgency to the American people, such as the possibility of war with Iraq. What would be the impact of a war with Iraq on Cuba?
The impact that the possibility of that war is already having for many countries, and specifically for Cuba, is that it has increased the price of oil to a considerable degree.
You think that George Bush is looking for an excuse to go after Saddam Hussein?
I am under the impression that he would feel frustrated if they do not manage to find some kind of bottle with a liquid that may be called a biological product or a chemical or a nuclear product.
Everything's going well until I ask what Castro considers a loaded question.
If it were possible to avoid a war, if Saddam Hussein decided to leave his country to avoid a war, would you take him in?
Are you trying to trick me? Are you asking me a trick question?
Hypothetically.
We do not wish a war, nor having to become a country granting asylum to either of the opposing parties.
Well, my question unleashes a half-century of foreign policy experience.
Don't believe that in Europe a lot of people want that war or would be happy with that war.
10 minutes into Castro's answer on asylum for Saddam Hussein.
Well, let me ask you...
Before finishing one idea, you introduce a new one. You never let me finish my idea. With pleasure, I will answer your questions. This is history I know very well. Men make mistakes. Saddam Hussein may be making a mistake, or the United States government may be making a mistake.
And Castro elaborates with historical references.
When the Nazis attacked the USSR, when they reached the border, they did not stop. I am not speaking about a moral issue here. I'm speaking about a political issue.
Castro's answer to the Saddam question, 25 minutes.
I do not think the United States has any right to launch that war. And nobody in the world agrees with the theory of surprise and preemptive war.
And what about communism, the central issue that divides Castro's Cuba from America, just 90 miles away?
Cuba is guided by a philosophy, a certain ethic. You may agree with this philosophy or not, just as you may or may not agree with a certain religion.
But why do you think there's been, as American presidents say, a march of democracy across the world and of free markets, but not here in Cuba?
To say that the world is moving towards democracy is a joke. You could assert that the world lives under a universal dictatorship.
You think the United States is a dictatorship?
It's not a dictatorship within the United States, but it performs dictatorial functions in the rest of the world. Who's going to say no?
How do you see this country years from now?
I see the future of Cuba as good, with real optimism.
Although a professed atheist, Castro frequently quotes the Bible.
The New Testament preaches a human generosity, starting with love thy neighbor, solidarity with the poor people, and the miracle of the fish and the bread, which is the miracle that we have attempted to achieve here, Andrea.
When we come back, has the communist economy failed the Cuban people? And despite the U.S. embargo, American companies 1 foot in the door in Cuba.
Guantanamera,
Nothing is more troubling to Fidel Castro than his island nation's economy, caught between its socialist past and an uncertain future. It's an economy stifled by state controls and 4 decades of an American trade embargo. Classic 50s cars may be picturesque, but they're symptoms of a deeper problem: no consumer goods. Average Cubans without a special job or status can't even buy a car.
What we don't do is import cars to sell them commercially in our country, with few exceptions. Cars mean gasoline, tires, spare parts, too many problems. That's why there are so many old cars. We oppose the creation of a consumer society.
In socialist Cuba, even if you inherit a home from your parents, you can't sell it or even give it away to a non-relative. There's been talk that you might move towards more property rights.
I don't see it happening. I haven't heard of any of those ideas. We have carried out certain reforms and changes, but we are not going toward capitalism.
So the Rosales family food shop can't expand. The government will not permit them to hire anyone who is not related. And dairy farmer Antonio Torres' family owned hundreds of acres before the revolution. Now he and his son are limited to a tiny plot of land and only 16 cows.
I get to keep the land only as long as I work it.
He's also forced to sell some of his milk to the government at below market prices. During our 2 days with Fidel Castro, we saw the sharp contrasts in Cuba's economy firsthand. New technology and outmoded agriculture like the state-owned sugar industry, once the backbone of Cuba's economy, now being downsized because of falling prices and high fuel costs. You have had to restructure the sugar industry, and 1 out of 5 workers are losing their jobs.
What it cost in hard currency to operate was more than the sugar was worth.
This mothballed sugar processing plant is being turned into a museum for tourists. What will happen to those workers?
We continue to pay their full wages. Exactly. And we send them to school.
This is a great point of pride for Castro, handling a painful transition creatively.
So, in our circumstances, we have found the perfect formula for us between streamlining what needs to be streamlined and having people better themselves.
He's pouring money into new industries like his controversial biological laboratories, where U.S. officials say he may be producing germ weapons. At our request, he personally escorts us to the labs, the first foreign journalist to see them.
Gracias. Do I have to worry about the audio through this?
In this sterile environment, Castro angrily denies the U.S. charge.
That really is offensive to our people's intelligence to say that we produce those weapons. Just to think we would be so stupid is insulting.
They, of course, say the same technology could be used for evil purposes.
In that, we are not going to please anyone. No, we will produce all the vaccines required to protect our people. We don't have to answer to anyone.
The industry has been struggling to compete in the past year, but Fidel Castro is their best salesman. He says they're already exporting 80 million doses of hepatitis B vaccine, their AIDS vaccine now in human trials. And nothing symbolizes the potential for economic change in Cuba better than this grain mill, now grinding Kansas wheat, the first to be imported under a humanitarian waiver to the U.S. embargo. Castro is clearly pleased.
What about the American wheat?
It's very good. It's very good wheat.
Don't speak ill of the Europeans, but tell me of the quality of the American wheat.
First, good price. Good price and quality need to be combined.
The mill is automated with Swiss equipment, runs 4 shifts of 4 workers a day, 16 people replacing more than 400. In the control room, Castro shows off manager Alicia Molina. She used to teach Marxist-Leninist philosophy, but he says those skills are no longer needed now that the Russians are gone.
How much more do you earn here than when you were a teacher?
She's not only doubled her teaching salary, she earns more than the agriculture minister. Castro jokes because she is more productive than he is. Fidel Castro is Cuba's CEO, micromanaging virtually every aspect of his socialist economy. Because Cuba is so dependent on imports like oil and grain, he studies commodity prices like a Chicago trader. He even manages minute details like the protein content of school lunches. And Castro acts more like Cuba's trade minister when he holds his first agricultural fair for U.S. companies. The fair produces $100 million in new contracts under that embargo waiver. Castro's personal favorite, California wine.
It is a tremendous opportunity.
Castro signs a contract to buy 30 million eggs from American producer David Radlow. But U.S. laws are still a headache.
You're going to fight through and cut through a lot of red tape, from going through Treasury Department to get a license to come down here to working with the Commerce Department.
Nearly 100 ships and 1 million tons of food in 2002. The port of Mariel, famous for Russian missiles and Cuban boat people, now you see American rice. And U.S. businessmen like Marvin Lehrer of the Rice Federation making new deals with the Cubans.
If we had a free and open trade situation with Cuba, Cuba could replace Mexico as the largest market for U.S. rice.
Cuba's government says it would buy 80% of its food imports from the U.S. if the embargo ended. And if Congress lifted the travel ban, this cruise ship bringing German tourists to Havana could instead be bringing Americans and their desperately needed hard currency. With a coastline nearly the length of California's, Caribbean weather, and the allure of an island long forbidden to Americans, tourism could be the economic savior of Castro's revolution. But this year it's 10% below the government's own projections. So the government tries to impress the Association of U.S. Travel Agents and their president, Richard Copeland.
First year in which Cuba's embargo would be dropped, we anticipate 1 million visitors.
But would Fidel Castro allow so many Americans with their democratic and capitalist values into Cuba?
Whether this would bring about more headaches or not, well, we may have to set quotas and say, let's allow 10,000 Americans a week to visit Cuba. We have that right.
When we come back, Fidel Castro talks about 10 adversaries, all U.S. presidents, his hopes for improved relations now, and his own place in history. In Cuba, one topic overshadows all else, relations with its giant neighbor to the north.
You've outlasted 9 presidents.
9?
Since Eisenhower.
All of them were elected with a lot of biases and great misinformation about Cuba.
I'm wondering, Mr. President, do you think that there could ever be an improvement in relations between our two countries with George Bush as president?
Look, I believe that it is too soon to reach a definite conclusion. Certainly he came to power the way they all did, with a huge lack of information about Cuba.
When I follow up the next day, he seems less pessimistic.
Quite often, unexpected things happen. I remember when relations between the United States and China improved. Nobody imagined they would. Apparently, nothing is impossible.
And Castro is more positive about the U.S. than he was 4 years ago, at the height of the crisis over Elian Gonzalez, when Cuban pride was at stake.
We have never rejected that relationship, but at the same time, we have never begged for it. And we feel very proud of our position of dignity.
Then and now, the chief obstacle, according to the U.S., is human rights.
There are people in the United States, including this president, who say that things cannot improve.
Hay personas en Estados Unidos, incluido este presidente, que dicen que las cosas no pueden mejorar hasta tanto no se produzcan cambios.
Any American would be amazed to hear that in order to improve relations with us, they had to change the Constitution of the United States.
Well, a lot of people still say that dissidents should not be put in jail, that people should have more freedom of assembly.
There are very few restrictions. I think, Andrea, that is a mere fabrication. In this country, the people move around freely. People leave the country.
Sometimes they leave by boat, a recurring point of tension between the U.S. and Cuba. Even with the Cold War over, both sides maintain big intelligence operations.
The CIA. The question is not what they hear, but what they do not hear. They can even see these boys and girls.
We talk about spies, appropriately enough, in a classroom that was a KGB base.
You had a famous spy in our Pentagon.
Ana Montez, a mole Cuba had in the Pentagon for 18 years, now in prison.
I think she's a noble American citizen opposed to this embargo that has lasted for over 40 years. I don't know how long she will have to stay in prison, but one day we will build a monument to her.
Castro is bitter about other Cubans convicted of spying after infiltrating Miami's anti-Castro groups. To him, these groups are terrorists.
It shall be the policy of this
Suspicions on both sides go back 40 years to the Bay of Pigs, John F. Kennedy's disastrous attempt to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro.
He tried to kill you.
He said that the best communist was a dead communist. I do not think that the best capitalist is a dead capitalist.
In the 60s, Castro survived several covert attempts to get rid of him. Today, he's almost forgiving.
Those who are supposed to make decisions sometimes make mistakes.
He still blames the Russians for the nuclear crisis in 1962, when the Soviet Union secretly placed missiles in Cuba aimed at the U.S.
Khrushchev's mistakes not only put the world on the verge of war, they put our country in great danger.
At the time, Castro was a lot more aggressive. Russian documents show he even wanted to secretly keep some small nuclear weapons on the island.
This is only a theory.
40 years later, all that has changed. Now he thinks the mistake would be to ignore chances to improve relations. So with al-Qaeda prisoners next door at Guantanamo, Cuba offers help if needed. And after 9/11, Castro said he wanted to be with the United States, not against it.
We offered medical support, blood donations.
But the United States didn't accept any of your offers. Did that surprise you?
No. Look, I can tell you this. We will do anything within our reach to prevent an act of terrorism against the American people.
Is normalization possible? Cubans think not as long as George Bush is president and his brother is governor of Florida. And the Bush administration says not as long as Fidel Castro leads Cuba. But what if relations were normal?
If the embargo ended? If Americans could come here and all of a sudden flooded Cuba with products and ideas?
Well, sometimes joking, I have said, let me know in advance so I can move. Because an invasion of hundreds of thousands of Americans here would be enough to make you move. I have said this as a joke. To respond to your question, I will say that we are not afraid.
What about Cuba and Castro's revolution after he's gone? Castro tells me his younger brother Raul will succeed him, but only for the short term.
I am a few years older than he is. 5 or 6. We're talking about another generation. I'm not a fortune teller, but I have much confidence that they are better trained, better prepared, and better educated than we were.
As Castro contemplates his own mortality, critics say he has much to answer for. Revolutionary methods like executing hundreds when he took over, jailing thousands, and driving so many others into exile.
Do you have any regrets about the way you've governed?
I regret that we haven't been able to do more and better what we have done. The most important thing is that we have not changed our ideas, our principles.
To Castro and his followers, that is his greatest virtue. To his opponents, it is his greatest failure. How will history judge Fidel Castro?
I do not share the preoccupation of many politicians for what you Americans call the legacy.
After more than 4 decades in power, Fidel Castro stands alone as a mysterious and controversial survivor of the Cold War. He remains an ardent communist, Cuba his revolutionary socialist experiment, in a world most see moving more towards capitalism and democracy.
For more on Andrea Mitchell's visit to Cuba and a full transcript of tonight's report, log on to msnbcreports.msnbc.com.